Good morning. I don't remember the rest of it. My bad. Something. I don't know. I'm not even gonna try. I probably should. That was the worst way I could have possibly have started this. It's okay though. Listen. We've got Genesis 10 and 11 with the boys and maybe girls tonight. Maybe. We'll see. I'm gonna be honest, a lot of it's just kind of genealogy stuff, although we do have the Tower of Babel in here, which is the highlight of today. The absolute highlight of today. Hang on a second. Actually, I have the notes for today over here, so let me pull those out, and I'll drag them over here real quick. There we go. Sweet. Perfect. Absolutely beautiful. And something just finished updating. Oh no, it's still updating. I don't know why something's updating on the computer, but oh well, what can you do? So how's it going today, guys? How's it going? Me? It's going pretty well. I can't complain. You know, I went to classes today, went to work today, went to the gym, shot some hoops, and now I'm here. Pretty full day. Not a bad day, though. I mean, the stuff that I learned about was pretty cool. Dude, I learned about some of the craziest stuff today about covenant treaties. I mean, I knew some of it already. I don't know if any of you guys want to know about this term, the suzerain vassal treaties. They were a very popular thing back in the day, and it's what the old covenants and the Sinai covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, they were based on the suzerain vassal treaties. I learned some really interesting stuff about them today that I didn't know about them previously, though. That would be a long conversation, though. I mean, I'd be down to go into that conversation, but that would probably take away from what we're trying to do tonight, though, unfortunately. So, oh yeah, let me put in the general that I almost forgot to send the message. Genesis 10 to 11. Live right now, exclamation point. And do this as well. Sweet. I'm not sure who's all going to be joining us tonight. I know Evan's not going to be able to be here, unfortunately. It's okay, though. It's okay. Well, I have his notes, and that's the important part, because he's a brilliant mind, and, you know, he's the brilliant mind behind this operation anyways, so it's a good thing he's here to, help to the notes and stuff. But yeah, I'm looking forward to tonight. You know, Tower of Babel, it you know, people usually think of it as, like, not a super deep story, but there's actually a lot that can be learned from it, if we're being honest. So yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it. I think it's gonna go well. Yeah, I can pull up the notes as well for the for it. Yeah, Evan has a lot of notes. Evan has a lot of notes for Tower of Babel. The first one, I'm actually really upset, because this very first thing he has written down, he knows a lot. Like, I don't really know anything about this topic, but he's really into it. So I wish he was here tonight to talk about it, but unfortunately, he's not here to talk about it. So maybe next week, if he's able to be here next week, then maybe we can get his take on it next week. But then again, we're also going into the beginning of Abraham's story next week, and there's gonna be a lot there to talk about. So unfortunate that oh well, what can you do? Also, we have a pitfall tonight, potentially. I'm gonna have to since we hit the 35 goal, that means we have to do pitfall, which I have like, listen, this is a janky setup because this is a very old game. You see this? This is a DVD reader for laptops. That's very old. And it currently has in it an exclusive version of Pitfall that very little people have access to because it was exclusive to Linux PCs. If you bought one, you'd get a disc. It's not like the old version of Pitfall, like the 8-bit version. It's actually like a 32-bit version, so it's like highly updated with a lot of other stuff in it. I haven't played it yet, but I saw somebody else play it for a little bit, and I had to boot it up to make sure it would actually work on my laptop. So I have confirmed that it does work on my laptop. It's just a matter of, now we just got to do it, because we hit the 35 goal, so now it's just a matter of getting it in. Getting in the special 35 stream, and now, actually, the next goal is 50 followers, which, if you don't know, that gets us to affiliate, which means we will have access to channel points, and we're going to have access to emotes. We already have some of the emotes made. I'm not going to spoil what they are, but we have some emotes already made, and I'm really, really excited about them. And channel points, we also have some really good ideas for that as well. Just have to set that up once we actually get access to it, because we can't mess with it until then. But no, yeah, oh shoot, I just realized we're live in the chess category instead of the just chatting category. My bad. Because we were playing chess last night. My bad. I forgot we were playing chess last night. Yeah, we were playing chess last night with everybody. That was super fun. That was super, super fun playing chess last night. But yeah, no, well, I need to get better at chess because I am not the greatest at chess. If somebody wanted to teach me how to play chess, that'd be awesome. I would appreciate a chess mentor. But yeah, no, we were playing last night. It was going really well for them, not for me, because I suck at it. But yeah, we'll see how it goes. We'll see how it goes. Can't spoil that stuff just yet. So how's it going? Whoever.
Vibing. What's poppin'?
Okay, there we go. I was gonna say I saw somebody joined. Let me do that real quick. Turn that up. I've got Evan's notes for Tower of Babel. I'm not gonna lie, he got far more than you know, I would have ever thought of because I've never studied it before. So like I was reading over his stuff and I'm pretty astounded actually at the stuff that he brought to the table because it's pretty good stuff. Like really good stuff. Yo, so any chance you would hear from Gavin or Ryan or Kirsten or Brianna or
I just texted Kirsten. Text Gavin.
Sweet. I wonder if he's still out trucking or if it's his time off yet. You know what, I'm gonna swap over to the Bible view. Oh, nope, that's a problem. We're gonna do that. That's what we need to do. That's the Bible view. What do you think, music today or no music today? I'm going back and forth on it.
I don't know, if we're talking, it might not be great.
Alright, music's going away then. Music is going away for the night. Which is fine by me. It's eating up my CPU power. I maxed out last night. 100% CPU. That was something. Something that I didn't think I would do. Unfortunately did it though. Oh well, oh well. Dude, so how nice was it up there today? We had like 78 degrees or
60
something.
something.
Yeah, it was nice today. It was so nice today. Not gonna lie. It was a super nice day out today. I wonder what Cole's doing. Cole was asking about Bible study. Told him to be at 8. And he's not
Dude,
here.
yesterday I cooked a bunch of jalapeno cheddar brats in a pan because it was like 30 degrees, and I'm like, missed my opportunity a week or two ago when it was warm. It's just gonna be cold. I was gonna cook them over the fire,
That's true. That's
and
true.
then today it was 60 degrees. I'm like, why didn't I just look at the weather and wait a day?
Well, I think later in the week it's supposed to get pretty cold again, from what I've heard. Unfortunately. But oh well. What can you
Had
do?
a had the thermo exam today.
Okay.
I don't know. I got everything answered,
Oh,
barely.
well, that's good at least.
Um, yeah, there are only 6 questions.
Oh. So, like, multi-page
Um,
long questions?
there were 2 that were like a full page. And then he put 4 at the beginning that were like short answer, multiple choice, and only 1 was multiple choice. Um, but he said he did that, and it's your score is only based on your final answer that you put in there because it's short answer or multiple choice, not your work. But they were only slightly less work than like the almost full page problems. So it's just his way of getting out of having to look at more exams and go through more work and give partial credit. So because he's lazy, we get screwed out of partial credit for a lot of the questions.
Nice. That's fun.
Yeah. And then I came home and did some laundry and dishes and cleaned. Fun stuff. I got a shower, and now I'm looking at next week's 306 assignment because that's the stuff I'm going to try to get done the whole class over spring break. And it's this Excel spreadsheet thing, but we're designing like a worksheet. And I really don't know what we're supposed to do because there's 7 pages. Like there's 7 pages of sheets on here. I don't know if we're supposed to replicate it or what.
Interesting.
Because there's not really like most of the time he's like, yeah, do this, then do this, whatever else. But this isn't. It's not very. I don't know. It's not like laid out or clear what you're supposed to do. It's just kind of like 16 pages of all this like random background stuff of like spreadsheet junk.
Mm-hmm.
And then on page 9 it says number 1, design a worksheet for wood beams,
Okay.
which is usually how he does like what we're getting graded on or the problem. So number 1 is design a spreadsheet for wood beams. But yeah, I don't know. It's you can change the height, you can change the width in a drop down tab of nominal sizes, and then you can also stack multiple boards edgeways beside each other.
Mm.
There is all your regular calculations for failure and beam bending. There's distributed loads, which is like if you like poured like 4 inches of concrete or something on top of it, like it's a force per unit of length, like 10 pounds of concrete per foot or whatever. And then there's point loads where like if you set like one large concrete block on any point of it, there's that force, and it says the minimum is a distributed force combined with a point load, like is what it has to be able to do. And then there is a whole nother like table I'm gonna have to make, and it's basically there are these two other variables like FB, FV, CR, some other stuff, and it's whether the wood is wet, like whether it's gonna be in the water or whether it's dry wood, like the moisture content, and whether it's repetitive members. So like if you put two 2x4s together, I think what they're basically saying is you can't calculate the strength of two separate 2x4s when you put them together. There's like a ratio of like maybe it'll be like 0.9% of what double the load would be or something.
Okay.
There's all these tables and like stuff, and it doesn't make much sense.
Interesting.
And he has like pictures in here, and before we literally made a graph in Excel that would update. Like it looked like a whole diagram of like a beam, but it would move the points around. Like if you made it like 10 feet instead of 12 feet, it would move in closer. And then if you made the cross section like a 2x4, it would update from like a 2x6, it would make it shorter. Like literally, like basically making graphics in Excel. And I don't see any of like we have to include that, but he has pictures all over the place. So I really don't know what he's expecting here at all.
Interesting.
Hello.
Hello.
I
We're slowly racking in people.
So you don't vibe with the green?
I don't know. I don't think so. Brianna said she liked that one too, but I don't know. I don't know if I like green that much.
Well, it's your bike. Get whatever color you want.
Yeah.
Yo, Cole, actually, while I've got you, how would you feel about taking some inspiring Twitch clips tonight? Out of curiosity. I gotta get as many people racking up as many Twitch clips as possible. I want a bunch of inspiring clips, a bunch of funny clips. You know, anytime that anything interesting happens. How do you feel about that? Before we get into the reading. You're good, man.
And there's a whole developer tab in Excel that is not normally there.
Oh?
So you can add like macros and shortcuts and random stuff in. And he had like a file we had to download like a .txt sort of thing and put the code into Excel. And I'm like, why are we doing all this? And then I figured out it was just so if I hit Control V, or not Control V, Control Y, it makes the cell that I have clicked on a certain color of yellow fill with a gray border. So I did all that work for something I could just like make once and then copy cell format and put everywhere that I need.
Well, Cole, I wish I could say it was good. I wish. But oh well. It'll be worth it. It'll be worth it in 5 months' time. Honestly, maybe less. I'm ahead of track. Like, a decent bit ahead of track, actually. Like, 5 pounds down in 1 month, which, at that rate, I would be down to where I want to be by, like, May. Maybe even sooner. So, we'll see. That would be nice. Then I wouldn't have to go through this pain for 6 whole months every day. Kirsten, are you still upset that Thursday night Bible studies are canceled.
Absolutely devastated.
Man, does this make up for it that you're here tonight?
We'll have to see.
All right, all right. Do you know the Tower of Babel story? Out of curiosity?
No.
You don't know the Tower of Babel story?
Wait, wait,
Ooh.
wait. Hold on, what is it though? I'm
Well,
not good with names. I might know if you summarize it.
well, I'm gonna read it here in a second. I could just read it now. You want me to just? I mean, we could just go into the reading. Are we ready? You like Dietrich? I don't know if you still
Wait, you said the tower?
Tower of Babel.
Is that the one where they go up and then changes languages?
Essentially, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I do know it.
Okay, okay. I was gonna say I know it's like a somewhat popular one that people like to talk about. They usually don't talk about what it
Mm.
actually means. They just kind of think, haha, funny, people don't understand each other. Which, to be fair, I do the same thing almost every time it's brought up. So I can't, say anything. Alright. Well, I mean, I can just read it if we want to. Dietrich, are you still busy doing stuff, or you just want to.
I'm probably gonna be background Excel for a little while here till I figure out at least what he's trying to get us to do for an assignment.
Okay, okay, okay. Well, we've got a lot of genealogy on this one, like on both sides of it, unfortunately. Um but the good stuff's in the middle. There's some good stuff in it. I'm debating whether I want to read I mean, I might as well read the whole thing. I don't want to skip over sections, but that does mean we're going to have a bit of. Well, because it's not entirely just genealogy. Like, there is some other information that is given that is kind of necessary going into Babel. So I guess I kind of have to read it. Oh well. All right. So we're coming off of Noah, right? So we just did the flood. The only people left are Noah and his wife and their 3 sons and then their 3 wives. So 8 people. So we already know his sons are Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? So starting off on chapter 10, these are the descendants of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Children were born to them after the flood. The descendant of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javin, Tubal, Meshesh, and Tiras. The descendants of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. The descendants of Javin, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Rodanim. Cole, you should use these names for your D&D stuff. From these, the coastal peoples spread. These are the descendants of Japheth in their lands with their own language by their families in their nations. Okay, so I'll stop for a second to explain what that last sentence means. So we just went over the descendants of Japheth, right? The last son. They are the coastland people. So they would have been the people who settled alongside the Mediterranean Sea, if that makes sense. So then we have the descendants of Ham. So these are Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. The descendants of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Habta, Rama, and Sabteka. The descendants of Rama, Sheba, and Dedan. Cush became the father of Nimrod. He was the first on earth to become a mighty warrior. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Urek, Akkad, and Kelna in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin, between Nineveh and Calah, that is the great city. Egypt became the father of Ludim, Ananim, Lehebim, Nephthalim, Pathrusim, Kosalim, from whom the Philistines come, and Caphtorim. Okay, so I'll stop again. So we just got to the end of Ham's descendants, right? The second son. So to explain a little bit, because this is stuff that we probably won't go over once we actually get through the whole passage. This is just like minor stuff. So if you notice, right, a lot of these sons, their names are actually the lands, like the name of the lands, right? So you probably recognize Canaan, right, was a major portion of that land that's going to be brought up a lot more. And the Philistines is another one, right? So those sons named Canaan and Philistine, like, and even Akkad, that's another one, right? And Babel, right? So we know we're going to get into Babel. The son Babel was, that land. The son Canaan was that land. The son Egypt obviously is going to be the land of Egypt once we get to that point, right? So that's just kind of how that's working out at this point. So then there's a little bit more to say. And if you're wondering about Nimrod, the first on earth to become a mighty warrior, we're going to get back to that. That's in Evan's notes. He knows more about that, but I can go over it a little bit. So continuing on with Ham, Canaan became the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Arkites, the Sinites, the Arvadites, the Zemarites, and the Hamathites. Afterwards, the families of the Canaanites spread abroad, and the territory of the Canaanites extended from Sidon in the direction of Gerar, as far as Gaza, and in the direction of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim, as far as Lasha. These are descendants of Ham by their families, their languages, their lands, and their nations. Okay, so this is extended what we were just talking about, the sons of Ham, the second son. Stopping again from reading the passage. Obviously, there's a lot more names in here that are going to be important as well, right? So we have Sodom and Gomorrah. That's going to be really important here in a couple chapters. Those should be pretty recognizable names. Well, at least somewhat. The Amorites is another big one. They're going to be a pretty big thing later on in Israel's story. And then there's also, it mentions in the direction of Gaza and, what was the other one? Gerar. Those are going to be some fairly important places later. So if you recognize some of these names, it's because these are going to be places that actually survive for longer periods of time and become part of the story later on. We're almost done with this stuff. Like setting up the background, right? Because that is part of the point of Babel, right? We have to understand the different people groups who were present at Babel, right? So the third son, Shem, going back to reading it, to Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the elder brother of Japheth, children were born. The descendants of Shem, Elam, Asher, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram. The descendants of Aran, Uz, Hol, Gether, and Mash. Arpachshad became the father of Shelah, and Shelah became the father of Eber. To Eber were born two sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in the days of the earth were divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Joktan became the father of Almadad, Sheleph. Okay, now these are getting tough. Hazar Maveth, Jerah, Sodomar, or Hodarim? Yeah, these are getting tough now. Dude, Cole, you definitely should use these names for your D&D stuff. Uzal, Dikla, Obal, Abimael, Sheba, Ophir, Havel, and Jobab. All of these were the descendants of Joktan. The territory in which they lived extended from Mesha in the direction of Shepher, the hill country of the east. These are the descendants of Shem by their families, their languages, their lands, and their nations. All right, so those are the three sons. They're all still in the Fertile Crescent region, right? So if you think about like a map, right, that's still a very small portion of the world, right? Like that little bit of land by the Mediterranean Sea, north of Egypt, and south of Turkey, right? Like a really small portion of land that they're settling, right? So the first son takes the west side. They're the seafarers because they're at the Mediterranean. The second son takes the middle. The third son takes the east portion of the land, which we don't know exactly how far east that goes, but it couldn't have been very, very far because all of these people were still very close together. Like, even though they were settling that portion of land is still a very small portion of land if you look at it on a map today, right? So going back to it, these are the families of Noah's sons according to their genealogies in their nations, and from these nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood, right? So this is going to show how they spread out to those places, right? So we have the Tower of Babel. This is the interesting part, right? So for this story, starting in chapter 11, now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said one to another, "Come, let us make bricks and fire them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals had built, and the Lord said, "Look, they are one people, and they all have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it is called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. That's going to be the important part. We'll just read this last section here real quick. Actually, maybe not. We'll come back to that. We'll come back to this section because it's kind of genealogy, kind of not. We can talk about Babel now that we're into it. So I'm going to pull up my notes here. But Cole, if you have any thoughts, Kirsten, I mean, Dietrich, you're working, but what do you guys think? Just as I'm finding my notes, anything interesting come to mind that maybe I missed that you like?
I always thought the whole language thing was very interesting.
Okay. How
Not
so?
just in the Bible, but in general. Like, what did they speak to begin with? Did God give them a language? You know, was there a programmed language in them that they knew they didn't develop?
Mm-hmm.
And did that language survive the Tower of Babel, or not? Like, was it one of the languages used, or was it completely gone and everybody got new languages?
Yeah. There is some actually pretty interesting history. I can actually, come to think of it, I can bring up some of my notes from Old Testament too, because at the beginning of Old Testament we studied as far back ancient history as we know, which comes from that region of the world. Like the earliest, the latest dated human artifacts we have come from that region of the world. I don't think that's a coincidence. That's where we find the oldest artifacts. But that is where we find the oldest artifacts, is from that region of the world. And there is really interesting because you can kind of trace back. You can't really trace back language, obviously, because there was no recordings of people talking. But you can kind of trace back the origins of writing language, which is really interesting. Like just through like tokens and stuff. It's really interesting, and I can bring up that at some point too. So actually, we can go back a second up here to Nimrod, because Nimrod is the only person in this whole genealogy who gets like a decent amount of attention, right? Like he gets this whole section. Cush became the father of Nimrod. He was the first on earth to become a mighty warrior. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was, and then it continues on with all of these people, right? Like nobody else gets any kind of praise like that. It's just like this person and they settled here, and this person and his descent, like, you know, like he's specifically special. And Evan has some notes on him. He knows a lot more about this than I do. Like the comparison of these two characters. So there's studies out there who compare this Nimrod character that's written here to Gilgamesh, which I don't know all the comparisons between these two, but I do know about Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh is to this day one of the biggest. So think like, you think back to like German and English mythologies, you get people like Beowulf, right? Like that's like the cool story, like the cool mythical hero you get from like that region of the world at that time. And like think back to like ancient Greek mythologies and the Egypt mythologies and stuff, like there's these like characters, right? The oldest one that we have is this story called the Epic of Gilgamesh that comes from like this, like it's written on like clay tablets. It's that old. It's one of the oldest mythical characters that we have any record of. Um, this crazy story about this, mythical hero, right? And his story is that he wants to become a god. And it's essentially the Epic of Gilgamesh because it's him embarking on this journey to become a god, right? And there's all these crazy things that he goes through and all these crazy things that the gods send his way and stuff like that. So the Epic of Gilgamesh actually has its own quote unquote flood narrative. And if you read it, it's very, very, very similar to the like Bible flood narrative, like almost down to the detail. Like it's weird how close these narratives are. So for example, I had to read this a couple times for a couple different classes, and I actually just read it last semester, and I did a one-to-one comparison of writing down everything that was similar between the two, and all the differences between the two, right? So in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story starts off with the heavenly court of gods deciding that they want to destroy their creation. Not because they were wicked, but because they didn't like them anymore, right? So in their eyes, back like for this specific mythology, the gods created humans out of clay to serve them, right? And I don't remember why they want to wipe them out. There's some weird reason to it. But they don't like them anymore. They want to get rid of them, so they send this flood to take all of them out. But Gilgamesh is told about it, and he's told the exact dimensions of the boat that he's supposed to build to save himself and some other people, right? So it's sounding pretty similar, right? So you have the details that God wants to send a flood to wipe out all people, and that he selects one person to save himself and some others, and he gives the exact directions of the boat to build, right? So those are the same. Differences being, in this mythology, there's multiple gods, and it's not because of their wickedness, it's just that they don't like them anymore. So those would be two differences. So it continues on, right? Him and his family build said boat. In Noah's story, the biblical story, the boat actually, and we talked about this last week, right? The boat that Noah is told to build, if you look at the dimensions that are given in the Bible, it looks very, very similar to that of like a cruise ship today or like a shipping vessel, which there's no possible way that a human back then, even if they made up the story, right? Like let's say the flood story was made up, there's no way that they would have gotten the dimensions that close for the boat, right? So that it would have actually maybe functioned. Like, even if the story was made up, those dimensions for the boat are so unbelievably specific to what we know actually works today, which is funny. But if you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's really funny because it's not that. The directions that are given to Gilgamesh to build is literally a box. Like it's literally like a square box that would have just been tumbling among the waves. It's kind of funny. But anyways, that's what he's told to build. So that's a difference.
I think there was a mythology that had one as like a circle, basically.
I mean, there's
a cylinder or something.
Yeah, I was gonna say there are a couple different flood stories that we have found that date to that time period. Like it's not just the Bible that has a flood story. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a very popular one, also has a flood story. And then there's also some lesser known flood stories as well that come from that time period, which is really funny. But I think you are right. I think there's another one that has a cylinder. I don't know which one it would be.
Yeah, I don't know if it was like India or something, but it was almost like a flat pancake or something like that.
Yeah. Exactly. It's so funny looking at these things. Like, I mean, the question then is like, oh, well then how are there so many of them that are so different from each other? The point that there's two standpoints that biblical theologians will take today, right? So the one standpoint is that this was the original story, and then as the descendants passed it through the generations, right? Like, even at this point, like, 2 generations later, there's how many sons, and not all of them cared about God, right? Like, so the idea is, you know, these older generations told the story, but some of the generations over time lost the actual meaning of the story and created their own, you know, figments of it, right? So that would be one explanation for it. Another explanation, which is interesting, I don't know about it, but the idea is essentially that the Israelites found this story and they rewrote it with their own God in mind. Which I know that sounds not so great, and I don't know if I stand by this one, but to be fair, we as Christians have also done the same thing with many, many things as well. So for example, right, like a popular one is the idea that Christmas was a pagan holiday. It was a Roman calendar event. I think it was made to celebrate the emperor. And as the Romans became Christian, they repurposed that holiday to be about Christ, right? And, you know, it's devolved back into a pagan holiday nowadays. But the idea is we took that holiday and we made it into something that was made to worship God, even though it had a pagan root. So it's not completely out of the question for this to be a pagan story that was reincorporated to put God in it. It's not completely impossible. I'm still more along the lines of the story got... So think about it this way, right? Like the Whisper game. Especially if these generations didn't... Especially, like, if these generations did worship Yahweh, they would have passed on the story with Yahweh in mind. But if some of these people turned away from Yahweh and started worshiping other gods, they would have reincorporated the story to, you know, keep those gods in mind, essentially. I'm more along the lines of that way, of that line of thinking. Anyways, well, oh yeah, so Epic of Gilgamesh, right? There are some details that get even crazier. So, for example, in the flood story of the Bible, Noah sends out a raven and a dove from the ark to see if there's dry land, right? That's a very, very specific detail. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, he does the exact same thing, except there's a third bird. I think it's a... What is it? There's a raven, I think it's a raven, a dove, and I don't remember what the third one is. But he sends out 3 separate types of birds in the Epic of Gilgamesh story. But also in the opposite order, right? So he sends out the dove first, and then the second type of bird, and then the third time he sends out the raven. In the flood story of the Bible, it's a raven first, and then a dove, which actually does have narrative significance because the dove is a sign of deliverance throughout the Bible, right? Anytime you see a dove, it's a symbol of deliverance, right? Or some kind of holy presence, right? So for example, in the baptism of Jesus, right, the Holy Spirit descends like a dove. It's a sign of the presence of God, or it's a sign of deliverance, right? And those can be synonymous together. But yeah, no, the Epic of Gilgamesh shares very, very similar details to that of the flood story. And that being said, there's people, and Evan has studied this more than I have, so he can talk more about it. I'm probably going to butcher it. There's people who believe Nimrod is Gilgamesh, right? Because there's a lot more stories that happen in the Epic of Gilgamesh other than just the flood narrative. There's all these stories of battle and how he became a great warrior and how he ascended to godhood. And the idea is, you know, here, Nimrod, he was the first on earth to become a mighty warrior after the flood. He was made a mighty hunter before God. Therefore, it is said, Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. I don't know the whole story, but there are people who believe Nimrod is actually Gilgamesh, right? Because not all these names made it through translation super well to English, right? Especially since, like, these are the very, very earliest stories of the Bible. There's a lot more interpretation that is needed for these ones than there would be for ones that would happen later on, right? Because we have basically no human record from this time period of our history, right? If you go back this far, we have very few artifacts from this time period. There's like a handful of written records. There's like nothing from this time period. I hope I'm making sense of this.
Does make sense, I think.
I'm kind of just spitting out a lot of stuff right now. Cole, you keeping up well? I know I'm kind of just spitting a lot of stuff out. Oh, no, 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 no. Okay. Wait. I messed up. I gotta go back to the right chapters. 10 to 11. So we got past Nimrod and Gilgamesh. There's a lot of stuff with Babel, right? So anytime, like, if you ever hear Christians talk about Babel, right? I mean, like, I made the joke earlier, but it's kind of not a joke, right? People talk about Babel. You see videos of it. You see Christians talking about it. It's usually, like, it's either to explain ethnicities and languages, or it's a way to just joke, right? Make a funny joke. Haha, they can't understand each other anymore. I see those memes all the time, right? There's a lot more to this story than that. Like, there's a lot you can take from this story, believe it or not. So I'll go with the first notes that Evan has, right? Because he has really good thoughts on this. So actually, I guess I should probably explain Mesopotamia first. If you don't know, this region back then, and still kind of to this day, is referred to as Mesopotamia, right? So whenever we talk about relics from that time period, like I was talking about previously, these ancient relics that come from this place from that time called Mesopotamian stuff, right? The Mesopotamian languages, the Mesopotamian relics, stuff like that. So his first note is the Mesopotamian ziggurat probably used for gods to reach humanity, right? So to clarify further, it was a common I'll just read what he says word for word. It was a common belief in the ancient Near East that gods acted like humans that eat, sleep, got intoxicated, etc. Humans were made by the gods that they could work for the gods, right? So that's what I was saying earlier. The gods to them. So their mythologies, right, weren't as succinct as, say, like a Greek mythology or an Egyptian mythology or any of those, right? Because those came a lot later on whenever there was written records and people were able to concise things a bit better. Like at this point in time, we don't, like, there probably wasn't even written languages at this point. That's how early in human history this is. Maybe there was. Maybe this is getting to the point in time where we would have had tokens and stuff, which I can talk about that later. But at this point, we probably didn't even have written language, right? So mythologies was just kind of like what people made up, right? And just by word of mouth, right? So it wasn't really succinct. It was kind of like, you come from here, you believe this about the gods, you come from here. But in general, people back then, if they didn't come from Adam's line, they believed that the gods were very human-like, and that humans were created by the gods that they could work for the gods, essentially, right? Which honestly isn't too different. Like, if you do look, say, at Roman mythology or Greek mythology, it's not very different, right? Because they believed very similar things about their gods. They believed that they drunk, and they had families, to put it lightly, thinking of people like Zeus. They ate, they slept, they lied to each other, they deceived each other, they went to war, you know, like very human things. Ways that you wouldn't really think of Yahweh, right? Ways that you would think of humans is kind of how they acted. So that's to say, you know, as he said, it was a common belief in the ancient Near East that gods just acted like humans, right? So his next point, the Tower of Babel was an effort to promote pagan god worship and to make a name for themselves, right? So at the time, they also believed that humans could reach godlike status. Like, they themselves could become a god, was a belief that they had back then, which was mostly in part probably because of the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Because there's this mythological story of this great hero that pretty much everybody knew about, which isn't mentioned in the Bible, but historically we know about this Epic of Gilgamesh and how widespread it was. We wouldn't have so many copies of this story if it wasn't a widespread story. Um, but the whole story is about him being told that he can become a god and then searching for that, right? So these people believe the same thing. They believed they could reach godhood, right? So this Tower of Babel is kind of a reflection of that if you look at it in that lens, right? The Tower of Babel, these people were pagan worshippers who wanted to become gods themselves, to make a name for themselves so that they could reach heaven themselves, right? Because if you remember back to when we talked about this in the flood last week, I think, and we talked about this previously in the creation story, right? Their belief of the structure of the earth was that, well, first of all, it was flat. That's like the whole way from our beginning of our history, the whole way up until like, what? When was that? 1400s, about 1400s, right? Whenever they decided the Earth was round. So that's a long period of history where we believe the Earth
Recent.
was.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, so that's to say they believed the Earth was flat back then too, but they also had other beliefs about it, right? So they not only believed it was flat, but they believed that it was held up by columns, like literal columns, that held it up, and that underneath was just water and shale, or not, or yeah, shale. And then they believed that the sky was a dome. All right, so think like if you made a bubble, right, and you put it on a flat surface, right, like a biodome, if that's a better way of thinking about it, right? They thought that the sky was a literal physical dome. Sandy's dome. That's a good example, right? I'm trying to throw out as many examples as possible to get a good picture in your minds, right? The Earth was flat. There was a dome above it, which was the sky. And the sun, the moon, and the stars were just dotted physically on this dome. And then the gods lived on top of this dome, right? So they believed that they believed it was a physical place, right? Not a spiritual one. So whenever they're talking about building this tower to reach the gods, they meant literally. They literally thought they could build this tower all the way up and hit the top of the dome and break through and become gods themselves, right? That's what they believed. Like, this isn't like a like funny story. This is like, no, they really believed this, that they could do this. So Evan's next note. They thought they could help God. Wait, that's weird wording. Sorry. They thought they could help God like he was one of their made-up gods or lesser divine beings. So they built a tower to heaven so Yahweh could come to them, right? So the idea is, they're like, to us, right, as Christians, it's a bit foreign, right? Because as Christians today, we believe, it's a spiritual realm. God is so much higher than us. Like, not like he's not like us. He's not like humans where we eat and sleep and like we can maybe be on the same level. We can achieve that kind of status one day. Like, we recognize that's not possible for us to reach that kind of status, but they thought they could, right? So these gods were lesser, quote unquote, right? Like lesser divine beings because they thought they were low enough that they could one day get there, right? So it's not that they were lesser beings, it was just lesser in that sense, right? Whereas Christians, it's he's so much higher above us, we can't reach that, right? So on top of this, right? So this is where it starts to become their pagan beliefs versus the Israelite beliefs of God, right? So this is where the funny change comes in, right? So the first half of the story is what they think and how the pagans would have believed then, right? That these gods were lesser, that they could reach them one day, that they could become one of them. And then it flips it around whenever Yahweh God, the Israelite God, comes into the question because it points out how much higher he is than everybody else by a fun play in words in the Hebrew that we don't have in the English, right? So we've already pointed out multiple times where there's funny Hebrew puns per se. Not really necessarily puns, but a way to like better understand the text, right? So the first one that is essentially in the Bible is Adam is a play on words because the Hebrew word for dirt is Adam, right? So there's something lost in the English there because the Hebrews would have understood that, and Adam was made from dirt, right? And then there's also Cain and Abel, right? Their names are lost to us in the English because in the Hebrew, Abel is Hebel, which is literally their word for vapor. So fleeting, going away, right? Cain, on the other hand, his name in Hebrew, I don't know what the Hebrew word is, but it means I am here, I am present, right? So they're contrasting. Cain is like, that sounds weird to say like I am here, but it's a very clear statement of like somebody is currently here and existing, whereas Abel is fleeting like a vapor, right? It's a play on words that we don't get. So there's another one here in that the Hebrew language is making fun of the people's tower, right? Not necessarily making fun of like it's a haha joke, making fun of in the sense that it's pointing it into the Israelite perspective and showing how different it is, right? So whereas, in their mind, the gods are probably like, oh no, they're going to build this tower up here and get to us. How can we stop it? Whenever you read it here in the Bible, the Hebrew, if you read it in the Hebrew, it's essentially saying God can't even see their tower because it's so small, right? So in the English it translates, and the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals built. In the Hebrew it would be a bit more clear what that's actually saying. It's like, oh, God just so happened to look down and see it like out of the corner of his eye, right? Like think like how like if you're on the space station, the International Space Station, and you can just barely see the Great Wall of China if you look down, it's the only man-made structure that you can human-made structure. Haha. I'll correct myself. To use scholarly language, human-made. It's the only human-made structure that you can see from space, right? Is the Great Wall of China. But it's even still you have to really look for it, right? It's the same way here, right? It's saying like God just so happens to look down and he does a double take and he's like, what are they doing down there? Right? Like it's completely different to how they would have been thinking of it, right? Completely contrasting to the Israelite Christian perspective. Well, to them, the Israelite perspective whenever this was being written, where Yahweh's different. He's higher than these gods. He's better than these other gods. He's not on the level of worrying about the Tower of Babel. He's on this other level where he's not even worried. He doesn't even notice it, right? Oh, yeah, and here's another note that he puts on top of that, right? So in the Babylonian view, they would have thought that this would have impressed any god, right? Like by them making this stand and making this great structure, they thought, oh, this will be so impressive to the gods, right? They'll be so impressed with us that even if we don't reach it, they will be impressed enough with us to let us come up anyways, right? Like it's such a feat that we're doing this that so it's a completely different perspective too, right? Like God doesn't even notice it here in this story, whereas in their minds, worshiping their pagan gods, they thought this will be so impressive, right? So then here's where you kind of get like quote unquote sermon material, but not really. Like you could use this for like if you were writing a sermon, but at the same point there is a point that this passage is trying to make and why it's here, right? So the point of that this story is getting to is that, and I'll read Evan's wording here because I think it's really good. Ironically, instead of the gods coming down to greet them, all that they have done is made God further away from them to the point where he scatters them, right? So them trying to achieve godhood actually drove them further away from God. And he scatters them out, right? And then on top of that, so there's another word here. And this one translates a bit better to English, right? Babel. You know, like Babel translates very well to English. That pun, quote unquote, gets to us, right? That one makes sense because we also say somebody is babbling, right? Like if you can't understand somebody, you know, like if they're just going on and on and on and on and speaking, but they're not understandable, babbling. So that one does translate well to the English. Therefore, it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the earth. Right? And it's the same way for them. Babel to them would have been understood, it was their word for confusion, right? So Babel is the word for confusion, symbolizing that the people that built Babel are confused not only in their language, they are not only confused by one another, but they're confused on who God actually is, right? Not only does God physically confuse their language, but these people were confused on the character and nature of God. They lost that at some point, from the point of Noah, whenever he died, and then however many generations, it looks like 3 generations or so, these people had already lost that. And they misunderstand who God is because they have gone out and made these other gods themselves that they think are on the same level as them. Right? But here's an interesting thing, right? You look at this story, and if you don't know about some of this stuff later on in the book, right? You look at this and you're like, what was the point of God doing that? Right? Like why did he have to confuse them and stop the project and scatter them, right? Like just let them do it. Right? I mean, he has nothing to be scared about. He doesn't even notice it at first, right? So what's the point of him doing that? Well, there's two things, right? And the first one is one that usually people point out whenever, you know, they would ask, like if somebody would ask a pastor or somebody who knows a bit better, this is probably the first response that they would give. But there's another reason as well that I'll get to. The main reason is because what they were doing was going against what God wanted for them, right? Like whenever we go back to the creation narrative, he says that what he wants for humanity is that they are fruitful and that they multiply, right? So that his goal for humanity is that they can live with him and live these peaceful lives and, you know, multiply and be fruitful and spread across the earth, right? And here they're doing the opposite of that, right? Like they're doing exactly what God doesn't intend for humans. They're staying together, and instead of you know, being fruitful and having a good time and multiplying and spreading across the earth, they're doing the exact opposite of that. They're working really hard, they're wasting their lives, they're not being fruitful, they're not multiplying, and they're not spreading across the earth. Like complete opposite of that, right? And God here, he doesn't strike them down with fire because of that. He does the peaceful solution, right? He shuts them down by doing what would be a fairly peaceful solution. He just confuses their language so that they can't continue the project. You know, he doesn't come down with fire and just kill all of them because they're doing the wrong thing. And on top of that, he doesn't come down with a booming voice and say, "You're doing this wrong, stop." He just does the simplest thing to shut it down. He just confuses their language so they can't keep the project going. Right? Like, it's not like, oh, God's the bad guy here for doing this. It's like, no, he did the sensical thing here, like the easiest thing he possibly could have done to shut the project down and get humans to do what they were made to do. But there's another thing, right? And me and Evan talk about this all the time, so if you've been here previous week and you've heard us talk about this, there's a common theme among the Old Testament law and writings and commands from God. And that is that they are made for the betterment of human thriving, right? So, for instance, right, if you get to the original Old Testament law, right, the huge sections of law in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, right, that's just these really, really drawn out sections of Israelite law, and it's like, why do we read this? We don't follow this stuff anymore. It's not important to us. They just did this back then, blah, 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 blah. We don't need it anymore. But it's still important for us to read for a couple reasons. And one thing is to point out how God was showing them, and we actually literally just talked about this somewhat in my class today on worship, is that God puts these in place so that their lives can be physically better, right? Things that they wouldn't have understood in their primitive state that God would have understood, right? And it, like, that's the thing, right? Like, that goes to prove something even further. Like, if you're arguing for the legitimacy of the Bible, right? That's a good one that you can use, is that there's all these things in that law that were very, very sanitary customs that were very good things for them to be doing that no other cultures participated in. And there's no way for them to have possibly known that those would have been good things for them, but they followed them anyways because God gave them to them. Like, there's no way they could have just made these things up, right? So let me give you some really funny ones, right, that are good examples, right? So, for instance, one that's really funny is that they are told that whenever they go to use the bathroom, they have to do so outside of the camp and bury it. Which is kind of funny to think about today, but at the time, cultures didn't do that. They just did it wherever they wanted, and then they would die of sickness and disease. God tells them, no, like, in your law, you're going to go outside the camp and you're going to bury it, right? And they just followed it because it was their law, right? But they didn't think of it as being sanitary back then. They didn't know about germs. They didn't know about, like, how diseases worked. They wouldn't have understood that. But God puts it in there because he wants them to live better lives, right? I can give a whole bunch of more examples, right? Like, here's a weird one, but it's a very common one, right? Like, the Bible talks about I'm just going to say it. The Bible talks about, and especially in the Old Testament, circumcision a lot, right? It's kind of like running joke nowadays, like, because it was their sign for being in covenant with God. But that wasn't for no reason. We know today that if you do that to your child, they're going to be healthier, right? So it's almost like God told them to do that because he's like, it's better for you. And in the same way, if we go back to Babel, right, it's the same thing. He doesn't just let them continue the project because he knows they're going to kill themselves. Like, if they just keep building this thing up higher and higher and higher, and they're just keep doing it out of ambition, they're either going to, A, work themselves to death, right? Like, if they're going to be building these things bigger than the pyramids, how many people are going to die just transferring these stones, right? Let's say that they do keep the project going. At some point, it's going to collapse on them. They're all going to die, right? Or, let's just say, right, maybe for some reason they're sophisticated enough that they can actually build a tower that's miles high, just for the sake of conversation. Let's say that they have the ability to do that back then. They're going to die of lack of air, right? There's no situation where them continuing to work on this project is to their betterment. No matter what, they die or they hurt themselves doing this. So the best thing God could possibly do is say, no, you don't know this is bad for you, but it is. So I'm shutting it down for your own sakes. For the betterment of you guys, I'm going to confuse your languages. I'm going to shut the project down peacefully so that you guys don't kill yourselves doing this project. Which, you know, it goes further to speak to whether the Israelites writing this story understood that at the time. We can understand that today. And we can glean God's character from this story in that he cares for us. He wants the best for us, regardless of whether the people care about him or not. These people who were building this tower, they were pagan people. They didn't care about him. They were trying to achieve godhood status themselves. And God still cared about them. And he did the most peaceful solution, which was to just confuse their languages and stop the project. Right? That speaks to the character of God. That shows who he is, that even these people who don't love him, who don't care about him, who are actively seeking to replace him, that he still cares for them and he wants to see the best for them. Right? Oh, it's storming out. I didn't even realize. I just saw a huge flash of lightning out my window. Well, anyways, I mean, that's all I've got for Evan's notes. There's a lot more that can be said. I could go talk, like, I could bring up my Old Testament notes, and I could talk about the beginning of human language. If any of you guys would want to hear about that, Cole, I don't know if you'd be interested in that. I know you kind of like working with languages and stuff, so I could pull up my notes on the beginning of human written language. If you'd want to hear about that, or Kirsten or Dietrich, if you guys want to hear on that at all, I can talk about that. But also, I mean, we have a little bit more after that. I mean, it's kind of just genealogy, but there's a little bit we can talk about in it. I mean, we kind of got to finish the chapter. Oh, hey, dude. How's it going?
I don't know.
Just still trucking, or?
No, I just got my truck all washed and cleaned out the whole inside and got parked.
Oh, nice. So
but I'm heading in here to get a shower. Oh,
okay. How long you been here? How much you get to hear?
I just joined right now.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was gonna say it's kind of a quiet night. Not too much talk on either Discord or chat, so I've just been kind of spewing information, which I don't usually like to do, but I guess that's what I'll do.
How late are you gonna be up till?
I mean, we're kind of getting to the end of the Genesis talk, but I'll definitely be up after it.
Alright, I might join then. I gotta go hop in the shower here and go that done, and then.
Okay.
If
Sweet.
You're still on a hop on when I get out.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, we got a little bit more to talk about. Okay, so Cole wants to hear more about the written language stuff, so I'll pull that up. Okay, sweet, dude. Sounds good, sounds good. Here, so I'm going to pull up my notes from Old Testament, and then we can go into that. Actually, you know what? I'll just leave it up over here so you guys can also see it. Sorry if my notes are really bad. Usually other people can't understand what I write. But hey, I mean, maybe there's some other stuff in here that you guys find interesting that I can talk more on. So yeah, so here's the thing, right? So here's kind of how the biblical, just so I can give you guys more background on some of this other stuff, right? So whenever we talk about the dating of the Bible, right, and when these stories actually took place, we're able to get it pretty decently well, right? So like in history, we break it down to the Bronze Age 1, 2, 3, the Iron Age 1, 2, 3, and then, you know, there's the Persian period after that, and then before the Bronze Age, there's the Neolithic era and the Chalcolithic era, right? And this is kind of how the biblical narratives line up with those periods. And some of these are very, very... So, like, the closer we get to modern day, the better that we can actually date these. Like, to the day, the later back we go, the harder it gets, right? So if we go, so this is where the Old Testament ends, right? So whenever the Persians allow them to go back to their homeland and they start reconstruction of the temple, and whenever Judaism like starts, right? Like whenever the race of the Israelites become the Jews, that portion of the Old Testament at the very end, we can date that very well because we have Persian records that actually talk about Israel and those kings. So we can date that stuff very, very well. So this period, right, 539 to 300. We go back a little bit. Iron Age 2 is the United Kingdom and the divided kingdom, right? So let's go back up to where we're at right now, right? So Genesis 1 to 3, which is the creation accounts, takes place, you know, somewhere between 10,000 BC and 3200 BC. That's a very, very large time span, but that's the best we've got, right? Because that's that whole time period, right? 10,000 BC to 3200 BC. We have almost nothing from that time period. We have like some artifacts, right? Some like clay stuff, right? And some like weird writings that some of them we can decipher, but those writings are so very few and in between because they haven't survived, right? So that's whenever we see like near the end of that 3200, right? Right whenever we get closer to 3200, that's whenever we get the, you know, moving from cave dwellers and hunter gatherers to the point where we get the emergence of agriculture and we see the beginnings of like human communities, right? So that whole time period is nothing, right? Because it's that, I mean, that we have nothing from that time period. There were no developments that we know of. It wasn't until we got closer to 3200 that we saw agriculture becoming a thing and human communities starting to form, right? That's Genesis 1 to 3 is somewhere in that time period. The next stage is the early Bronze Age, right? Which history, if you look at history, historians and stuff, I'm not even just talking biblical stuff, I'm talking in general, they date the early Bronze Age to be 1300 to 2000, right? Genesis 4 to 11, what we've just gone over, right? So that's the flood and Babel and everything else that happened after the flood or after creation, right? So Cain and Abel, the flood, those generations, Babel, Genesis 4 to 11, everything happens in the early Bronze Age, 3200 to 2000, right? That's whenever we see ancient civilization and the beginnings of, you know, some like stuff that we can reasonably see, like some developments that we can somewhat trace and some civilizations that we can kind of put together, right? And what we're about to get into is the Middle Bronze Age, which is 2000 to 1550, which is going to be Abraham to Joseph, Genesis 15 to 50, right? That's going to be whenever, so like, for example, that's going to be whenever we get some history of Egypt, right? I mean, that's not going to be like the height of Egypt. That's not going to be pyramids. That's not going to be Sphinx. That's not going to be stuff like that. That's going to be like very, very early Egyptian records before they even had pharaohs or mythology, right? That's going to be whenever they still called them kings. So it's very, very early Egypt, and that's very early Mesopotamian civilizations. So like we have some records from that time period, not a lot, right? Like we have enough that we can kind of trace these different civilizations, like we can name some of them, but it's still not that great, right? So Abraham to Joseph, Genesis 12 to 50 would take place during this time period. After that point, things get a bit more clear, right? So we have Exodus, and we have some records from Egypt that talk about the Israelites and the Exodus and stuff like that. Not super well, but, you know, we have a little bit of record of that, and we know a lot about the Egyptian Empire during that time. Like historically speaking, outside of the Bible, we do have quite a bit of records from that time. Records mostly from Egypt and Canaan, right? Those were the two major powers at that time, and the Israelites were right in the middle, right? So Egypt was a big major power at that time. Canaan was a big power, and they kind of fight each other, and Israel gets stuck in the middle of that. We have records from both of those, right? And then there's a lot more after that we'll get into later once we get into those sections. But that being said, let me see if I can find the notes on Oh yeah, so here's the notes from the time period we were just in, right? The Neolithic and the Chalcolithic ages, as historians call them, right? 10,000 to 3,200. So this is whenever we see the development from food collection to food production. We see the development from nomadic life to sedentary life. We have a little bit of relics involving pottery and irrigation and metallurgy involving a little bit of like copper, slowly moving into bronze. And this is where we have a bit of writing as well, right? So we know writing was, well, Cole, you would know about this, right? So they had copper during the Neolithic and Chalcolithic eras, so they were able to make like some tools for irrigation and metallurgy, but they didn't have bronze yet, right? So that's going to be the Bronze Age whenever they develop bronze, and that's, as you would probably know, a mixture of copper and tin, and it makes it a lot stronger. But this is one, maybe I don't have, I mean, I know about the writing, so I can talk about it, but I guess I don't have specific notes on the writing, unless if it's in this section of notes. Let me check. I mean, I can talk about it regardless, because I know a bit about it. So this is about Egypt, two conflicting, Mesopotamia and Egypt. Development of writing. So here's a little bit. Or this is going to be the development from ideographic to logographic. So I got to talk about some other stuff first. So Cole, I'll go back a little bit before we get to this part that's written here. So the foundings of writing that we can trace back actually goes back to trade, right? So they didn't have money, they bartered back then. And dude, it is storming out. I don't know if you guys heard that, but it is like loud storming out. I'm gonna close my window. I don't want that lightning coming through the camera. But so they bartered back then, right? Is how they got stuff, right? Because we got to the point where communities were starting to form and they weren't nomadic anymore. They settled down, right? So one person would be good at metallurgy with copper, right? And another person would be a hunter, and another person would be a farmer, right? Because we saw the beginnings of irrigation, right? So it's like, I want your tools, I'll give you blah, blah, blah sheep, right? But even back then, they kept records of that stuff, right? Because they didn't want people cheating them. They didn't want things like that. So they had these clay tablets, right? Actually, before the clay tablets, they had rocks, right? And they were painted rocks, and they would keep those in their pockets, and whenever they would do a trade, they would take those rocks, right? And different rocks resembled different things, and that was how they would keep track of their records, because, you would give your stuff, and then they would give you the rocks to show that they purchased so-and-so and so. And then you would have those to show, I gave so-and-so to this person because I have this receipt, quote-unquote, right? I gave this person 3 sheep, so I got 3 rocks that were this color, right? It was kind of how they did it. It's a bit more complex than that, but essentially that's how it boiled down, right? At some point, that started to get too messy, right? You go to do a trade, people travel from one town to another, and they don't have the right rocks, right? Like, this civilization uses a different form of keeping track of stuff, and you don't have it, so how are we going to do a trade? That was whenever they developed sort of ideographic writing, and it was very basic, right? They were, think like Egyptian hieroglyphics, but more archaic, right? So this sheep-looking symbol resembles a sheep, and I get a clay tablet, and I draw this symbol on here to show that I gave this item, right? Because they weren't developing writing so that they could keep records. They were developing writing at this point so they could keep track of bartering. Was how it started, right? So they would get these clay tablets, and they would use these couple symbols to resemble these certain things, essentially. And we have tokens from this era that were a mixture of these two things, right? So At the beginning, they were rocks that resembled these things, and then it was clay tablets with those symbols on them. There were also these tokens with the symbol on them, and you could give that token with the symbol on it, and that would be the same type of thing. And we have some of those tokens, which is kind of cool. Not a lot of them. Not a lot of them survived, but we have some of them. And none of this is coming from the Bible. I'm just clarifying that. None of this is coming from the Bible. This is coming from archaeology and historians. So, the next development comes during this time period, the early Bronze Age, right? So right around the time of Babel, right? So that's what I have written here in the notes, right? If we come back down here, this is the move from ideographic writing to logographic writing, right? So the ideographic is one sign, right, equals one thing, but now it's logographic, which is one sign equals one word or idea, right? So instead of one particular symbol resembling one thing, now they have specific signs for individual words or ideas, which is whenever we get into Egyptian hieroglyphics, right? Because those are more complex than the ideographic writings of the Neolithic and Chalcolithic era. Because those don't just symbolize things, they have specific logos that resemble words and ideas. So that's why whenever we read Egyptian hieroglyphic, we can have records of history and events and stuff like that, because it's developed to that point. So, and that's what it says here, right? So potentially by the time of the end of the Chalcolithic age moving into the early Bronze Age, there was potentially a universal written communication system. This is supported by the Babel narrative we just read, sort of, and supported somewhat by archaeology as well. It's believed that, which is interesting, right? Because that goes to further prove that this event in the Bible probably did happen. Because they believe in archaeology and history that there probably was a universal writing system by that time. It was like archaic, like Egyptian hieroglyphics, but they believe that there probably was a universal writing system, and Babel kind of supports that, because everybody would have spoken the same language if it was a universal writing system. So if there was a universal writing system before the early Bronze Age, then how do we have, right? So that's the thing, right? So by the time we get to the early Bronze Age, if we look at records from these civilizations, there's like hundreds of variations of Mesopotamian languages. There's so many of them. There are so many different variations of Mesopotamian languages by the early Bronze Age. And before the early Bronze Age, just a couple hundred years beforehand, there's that's not a thing. They believe it was a universal writing communication system, right? So how does that happen? Unless if something like Babel actually happened, right? Which just goes to further prove like this probably was something that happened, right? Which is really interesting to think about. But then, so this moves on. There's another development in a later era. So this is getting way past Babel. This is getting into like kingdoms and stuff like that. This is where we get the Hebrew language, which is something I'm gonna have to learn at some point. Gosh, that's gonna be a pain. That's where we get to like the Hebrew manuscripts of the Bible and other manuscripts from that time. We move from logographic writing to I forget what it's called. Let me see if I have it written down anywhere. But that's where we get to essentially like syllables, kind of, almost. We're getting there. Yeah. So here we go. So Middle Bronze Age development. So this is around the time of like Egypt, right? Like the height of Egypt. So we get syllabic writing, which goes from the previous system, which is one sign equals one word or idea, to one sign equals one syllable. So now it represents the sounds of particular languages, not the signs of particular things. And the reasoning for this development was because, first of all, it was more efficient, right? But it was also easier to learn. You didn't have to learn hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of symbols to learn what they represented. You just had to learn one you know, like think about our alphabet, right? We have 26 to represent the different sounds that, and obviously we can make more sounds than the 26 letters of the alphabet, but you get the point, right? 26 is far less than hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. Like, think if we had one word, or we had one sign for every single word, right? That'd be infinitely more confusing than what we have with syllables, right? And it wouldn't be English, right, where there's a whole bunch of syllables and all these different words. How they had it was more like 2 to 3 syllables per word, like 3 different sounds per word, 3 different symbols per word. Essentially, it was a lot more simple and archaic than how we have it today. But it was still the move from ideographic to logographic to now syllabic, right? And then that's just going to continue, obviously, into the future where we continue with syllabic writing, and obviously it gets more complex over time. But this is about the time, about 2000 to 1550, where we got syllabic writing, and we can prove that. Like I said, none of this is coming from the Bible, what I'm saying right here. This is all just history and archaeology and stuff. But yeah, that's whenever we get like syllabic writing. That's the third development, and where we're still at today is now it's just symbols for sounds. And it's easier to learn, it's more efficient. But here's the thing, once we move to syllabic writing, the potential for a universal medium of communication is completely lost. Once we get to that development stage, there is no chance for a universal medium of communication from that point on. And that's where we're still today. There's no, I mean, we could, like, nowadays with technology, we could probably get to that point again. But think about that. Like, what, this is 2000 BC to now we're 2080, 4,000 years where it's been this way, where there's no potential for any kind of medium of communication at this point. And here we go. This is it. So this is where we get the Babylonian writings. This is where we get Epic of Gilgamesh. This is where we get the Enuma Elish, so the Epic of Gilgamesh is what I was talking about earlier. The Enuma Elish is the Babylonian creation story. It's very different from the biblical creation story. There's the Urnamu, which is the oldest known law code, believe it or not. We get it from Babylonia. And there's the Code of Hammurabi, which is the quote-unquote best known ancient law code. So once we get to syllabic writing, we get much more writings because it's much more possible, it's more efficient, it's easier to learn, so more people are able to do it, more people are able to read and write these things. They're actually able to like write things and copy them and spread them around, and no longer is writing solely about bartering. It's now about stories and keeping family history and things like that, right? So yeah, that's essentially the development of language throughout time. Cole, I don't know if you found that super fun and useful, but I figured you might want to hear about that. I kind of figured, at least. So I mean, Cole, do you have any questions about it? I mean, obviously there's a lot more that I don't know about it. I'm not like the most knowledgeable in this subject. I just know I know enough to get by whenever it comes to this subject. But there's obviously stuff that I won't know about it, or probably even some stuff that I might have somewhat butchered. There's definitely better ways of explaining it. But I mean, Cole, does that make sense? Or is there any questions you have about it, or? I mean, also, we have, I mean, we can end off. I mean, I went through Evan's notes. I kind of went through everything that I was going to talk about, with talking about God's character and talking about Gilgamesh, and, like, the history of it. I mean, we got this last section to read through, but I can, if there's no, like, questions or thoughts or anything from anybody, I can just read the last section and we can, call it there. I mean, there's not too much to talk about in this last section, to be honest. I mean, there's a little bit. I can talk a little bit about this last section before we go into Abraham, because this section's going to end with, you know, Abraham's father, right? So that we can go into Abraham for chapter 12. So. All right. Well, yeah, I can read the last section then. So it's a bit more genealogy, but there's a little bit to it that I can go over. So chapter 11, verse 10, starting there. These are the descendants of Shem. When Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived after the birth. So I guess I should clarify before going into this, because I guess it's not super obvious. So this first genealogy that happens before Babel is it's a genealogy, but it's not talking about one specific line of people. It's a genealogy that is talking about, in general, all of the sons, so that we can clarify where they were living before the time of Babel. The second genealogy also covers Shem and his son. So we went over Shem and his son earlier in the first genealogy, but this genealogy is different because this genealogy is going to be following one specific line, which is Shem's line. So we had Noah, his one son is Shem. We're now following Shem's line of firstborn sons so that we can get to Abraham, right? So this one's different, right? So we're going over Shem again, which is the son of Noah, but this time we're following one specific line of people instead of, in general, all of the sons. So these are descendants of Shem. When Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived after the birth of Arpachshad 500 years and had other sons and daughters. When Arpachshad had lived 35 years, he became the father of Shelah. And Arpachshad lived after the birth of Shelah 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Shelah had lived 30 years, he became the father of Eber. And Shelah lived after the birth of Eber 433 years and had other sons and daughters. When Eber had lived 34 years, he became the father of Peleg. And Eber lived after the birth of Peleg 30 years and had other sons and daughters. When Peleg had lived 30 years, he became the father of Reu. And Peleg lived after the birth of Reu 209 years and had other sons and daughters. So here you can see the age that they're living is moving down quite a bit, right? So not 900 years, it's 400 years, 200 years, and now we're going to go to 100 years and 70 years, right? So after the flood, it sharply decreases after just a couple generations. So that goes back to what we were talking about last time. So when Serug had lived 30 years, he became the father of Nahor, and Serug lived after the birth of Nahor 200 years and had other sons and daughters. When Nahor had lived 29 years, he became the father of Terah. And Nahor lived after the birth of Terah 119 years and had other sons and daughters. When Terah had lived 70 years, he became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Right? So that's that section, right? And the big thing to point out there is the decrease in their age decreases very sharply, right? Like that's Shem, the direct son of Noah, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 generations after that. Only 8 generations, and it decreases from 900 years to 119 years. Sharp decrease. So the last section, just the last couple verses, leads into Abram, and Abram becomes Abraham if you don't know. So now these are the descendants of Terah. Terah was the father of Abram, who would become Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran was the father of Lot. Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren, she had no child. Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. And essentially, that's just a short way of ending this section, right? So Genesis 1 to 11 is one section, not just historically speaking as we've shown, but also story-wise, right? So the first 11 chapters of Genesis serve as these kind of more mythological stories that the Israelites passed down from this time period, that are very different from what we're going to move into. So not only historically speaking is this going to be a change, because we're moving from nomadic, Neolithic, and Chalcolithic ages to now moving into Abram and Sarah, now we're moving into the early Bronze Age, where there's now civilization, and there's language, and there's writing, right? So it's a very different time period, historically speaking. But also, narratively speaking, this is very different because it's no longer these stories. Now it's more history, right? This is more grounded. There's not really interpretation anymore, right? In all these stories that we've been talking about so far, all of these previous weeks, there's been a lot of interpretation. There's been a lot of narrative criticism to put into it. Narrative criticism speaking in the sense that we're not criticizing it badly. We're breaking it down to its basic points, right? So there's a lot more interpretation to these stories. There's a lot more, did it actually happen, or was it a story meant to teach something? Now we're moving into Abraham and Sarah, and now it's to the point where there's not really question, right? Like this happened to some extent. It's still a narrative, so there's features that make it into a narrative, but these are people, these are places. Like for instance, we talk about here the land of that they came from. We know that was a place. It's been dug up. We have records from this place, right? There's no longer did this place exist or any, like, these are places that existed. These are events that we have some kind of record of. Things like that. So historically speaking, we're moving into a new era. Narratively speaking, we're moving into a new era. And this is kind of a transition into that, right? We're moving now. We've got Abram, and this is kind of a segue, right, into what we're going to be talking about, because now we're going to be moving into Abraham's story, and how he moved from his land, and how God made covenant with him, and all of these things moving into the story later on. But we could talk about Abraham next week. He's got a long story, but there's good stuff in it too. So yeah, Genesis 12 will be next week. We get them moving to the land of Canaan and traveling through Egypt. They get to meet the Pharaoh and some cool stuff like that. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Cole, if you're still here, hopefully I get to see you next Wednesday. I appreciate you coming by and chatting and everything. All that good stuff. Dietrich and Kirsten, you guys were cool too.
I'm taking a
Appreciate you
break
guys
from
being
the
here.
school stuff.
Oh, well, I was gonna say I was just about to end it here. I mean, we kind of already talked about everything to talk about in this section, so I was about to
I really
end
didn't have much to add because I just don't know,
it.
the history or none of that.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. I mean, like I said, it was only Cole and chat today, anyways, from the looks of it. So I just got into that mode where it's like, oh, well, there's not really much talk, so I don't mind going into just talk mode, I guess. So I can make that transition when need be. So, but yeah, I think I'm gonna call it there. At some point, maybe tomorrow, depending on how things go, we can do the Pitfall stream. I was gonna maybe do it tonight, but I forgot to announce it ahead of time. Plus, I mean, I'd like to do a longer stream than that because we'd probably only play for like an hour or so tonight. So, sometime coming up here, we're gonna do the Pitfall stream. Maybe tomorrow, depending. I'm supposed to go to something tomorrow night, but I don't know what time that's gonna be yet. So, depending on when that is, we can maybe do it tomorrow. I'll announce that ahead of time. If not, probably just sometime this weekend. Probably we'll do that. That'll be a fun one. I'm looking forward to that. But yeah, no, it's been fun. I guess, yeah. Thank you for stopping by. I'll see you guys next time.